A first-class ticket on a transatlantic flight should buy you comfort, not contempt. For Dr. Serafina Hayes, it bought her humiliation. Fresh from a grueling humanitarian mission in Sudan, all she wanted was to rest and fly home to her husband. But to the flight crew, her glorious crown of natural, tightly coiled hair was an object of ridicule. In the rarefied air of the premium cabin, she was whispered about, mocked, and treated as if she didn't belong. They thought she was just some woman who'd gotten lucky with an upgrade. They had no idea who she was. And they certainly had no idea who her husband was until he walked out of the cockpit. The scent of recycled air and expensive leather filled Dr. Serafina Hayes's nostrils as she settled into seat 2A. The seat was more of a pod, a private cocoon of beige luxury that promised champagne wishes and caviar dreams for the 9-hour flight from London to New York. For Serafina, it promised something far more valuable: sleep. She was bone-tired, the kind of exhaustion that settled deep in your marrow and made your thoughts feel slow and heavy. For the past 3 months, she had been leading a pediatric surgical team in a makeshift clinic on the outskirts of Darfur. She had seen things that would haunt her, forever performed miracles, with dwindling supplies, and held hands that were too small and too frail. The dust of the Sahel still felt like a film on her skin, a stark contrast to the sterile, climate-controlled environment of the Orion Air first-class cabin. Her husband, Adrian, had insisted on the ticket. "No argument, Sarah," he'd said over a crackling satellite phone line a week ago. "You're not folding yourself into a coach seat after what you've been through. Let me bring you home in comfort. Please." She had smiled then, the first genuine smile in weeks. Adrian. Her rock, her solace. They'd been married for 5 years, a whirlwind romance that had solidified into a partnership of deep respect and unwavering support. He understood the demands of her work, and she understood his. It was a perfect balance. She ran a hand through her hair, a magnificent, sprawling afro of tight 4C coils. It was her crown, a testament to her heritage, and a feature she wore with unapologetic pride. Today, she had it picked out, a perfect halo that framed her high cheekbones and intelligent, weary eyes. It was a statement. In a world that often told black women their natural hair was unprofessional, unkempt, or unruly, Serafina's hair declared that she was present, powerful, and whole. "Can I get you something to drink before takeoff, Mom?" The voice was crisp, professional, but held a note of something else. Something cool and dismissive. Serafina looked up at the flight attendant. She was a woman in her late 40s, with blonde hair pulled back into a severe chignon. Her name tag read Brenda. Her smile was a perfect painted-on crescent that did not for a second touch her eyes. "Just some sparkling water with lemon, please," Serafina replied, her voice warm despite her fatigue. Brenda's eyes flickered from Serafina's face to her hair and back again. It was a microsecond, a barely perceptible glance, but it was laden with judgment. It was a look Serafina had seen 1,000 times before. In boardrooms, at academic conferences, even at parent-teacher meetings for her niece. It was the look that questioned her presence in spaces of privilege. Brenda gave a tight nod and turned away. A few moments later, another younger flight attendant with a name tag that read Tiffany approached Brenda near the galley. They thought they were being discreet, but in the quiet cabin, their whispers carried. "Can you believe that hair in first class?" Tiffany murmured, her voice a saccharine poison. Brenda made a soft, scoffing sound. "Probably an upgrade. Points or something. Some of them have no idea how to present themselves." Serafina's stomach clenched. She closed her eyes, breathing deeply. "Don't let them steal your peace, Sarah. You've dealt with warlords and cholera outbreaks. You can handle a pair of petty flight attendants." She tried to focus on the soft classical music playing through the cabin speakers, on the plush feel of the blanket provided, on the thought of Adrian waiting for her at JFK. But the damage was done. The cocoon of seat 2A no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt like a fishbowl. Brenda returned with the water, placing it on the small table beside Serafina with a little more force than necessary. The glass clinked loudly. Not a drop was spilled, a testament to her practiced hand, but the gesture was unmistakably aggressive. "Will there be anything else?" Brenda asked, her tone suggesting she hoped the answer was no. "No, thank you. This is fine," Serafina said, keeping her voice even and polite. She would not give them the satisfaction of a reaction. She was Dr. Serafina Hayes, a respected surgeon who had saved countless lives. She would not be diminished by this. As the plane began its taxi toward the runway, Serafina watched Brenda and Tiffany interact with the other first-class passengers. An elderly white couple, in 3D and 3F, were fawned over their jackets, taken with reverence, their drink orders discussed as if they were matters of state. A businessman in 1A, a Mr. Peterson, according to their deferential address, was treated like a visiting monarch. For Serafina, there were only curt questions and those lingering, judgmental glances. A third flight attendant, a young man named Mark, joined the other two in their quiet conspiracy near the galley. He giggled at something Brenda whispered, then peeked over the seat backs toward Serafina, his eyes wide with a kind of cruel amusement. The humiliation was a slow-burning fire in her chest. It wasn't about the water or the lack of fawning service. It was about the fundamental denial of her dignity. They looked at her and saw not a paying customer, not a human being, but a caricature, an anomaly in their polished world. Her hair, her skin, her very presence was an affront to their narrow definition of first class. The plane finally lifted off, soaring into the grey London sky. Serafina leaned her head back, the soft leather, doing little to soothe the tension in her neck. She pulled out a medical journal from her bag, hoping to lose herself in an article about new techniques in reconstructive surgery. But the words swam before her eyes, blurred by the sting of unshed tears. For the first time in 3 months, she felt utterly and completely alone. The flight had only just begun, and she already knew it was going to be one of the longest of her life. The first hour of the flight passed in a haze of forced indifference. Serafina kept her nose buried in her journal, the dense medical text serving as a shield. She could feel their eyes on her. Whenever one of the trio, Brenda, Tiffany, or Mark, walked past her seat, their steps seemed to falter slightly, their gaze lingering on her hair before flicking away. It was a constant, unnerving scrutiny that made the hairs on her arms stand up. Lunch service began. The aroma of seared salmon and rosemary roasted vegetables filled the cabin. Mr. Peterson in 1A was presented with his meal as if it were a work of art. Brenda knelt slightly to speak with him, her voice a low, respectful murmur. "Is the wine to your liking, Mr. Peterson? Can I offer you a fresh roll?" When Mark arrived at Serafina's seat, his approach was clumsy and devoid of any of the grace afforded to the other passengers. He held the tray at an awkward angle. "Your meal," he said, "not your salmon," or "your lunch," just a flat, impersonal statement. He placed it down without a word about the dish. Serafina looked down. It was the correct meal, but it looked rushed. The salmon was slightly broken. The asparagus spears lay in a messy pile, unlike the carefully arranged plates she'd seen delivered to others. It was another small cut, another paper-thin slice at her dignity. "Thank you," she said, her voice betraying none of her inner turmoil. As Mark turned to leave, Tiffany passed by, heading toward the galley. She caught Mark's eye, and with a subtle tilt of her head toward Serafina, She mouthed a single word, her lips forming a perfect malicious "Oh." "What?" Mark mouthed back, confused. Tiffany patted her own sleek blonde ponytail, and then made a large, circular gesture around her head, her face contorted in an exaggerated look of confusion and disgust. "The hair." A snicker escaped Mark's lips before he could stifle it. He scurried away towards the galley where he and Tiffany devolved into hushed, cruel laughter. Brenda watched them from a distance, a thin, approving smile on her face. She was the queen bee, and this was her hive. Serafina's appetite vanished. She pushed the salmon around her plate, her stomach a tight knot of anger and hurt. She had faced down death. She had sutured wounds under the dim light of a generator. She had told a mother with all the compassion she could muster that her child was gone. And here in this capsule of supposed luxury, she was being broken down by the playground antics of 3 bullies in uniform. She decided she'd had enough. This was not just rude, it was a hostile environment. She pressed the call button. It was Brenda who answered, her pace deliberately slow. She arrived at the seat and stood over Serafina, her posture radiating impatience. "Yes, I'd like to speak to the purser, please." Serafina said, her voice quiet but firm. Brenda's perfectly plucked eyebrows rose a fraction. "I am the purser, the cabin service manager for this flight." Of course she was. The ringleader was in charge. "Then I need to register a complaint," Serafina continued, meeting Brenda's cold gaze. "The behavior of your crew has been completely unprofessional and offensive. I've been subjected to whispering, mocking gestures and a general sense of hostility since I boarded this plane." Brenda's facade of politeness cracked, revealing the raw contempt beneath. She let out a short, sharp laugh that was pure derision. "Ma'am, I can assure you my crew is the best in the fleet. Perhaps you're being a little sensitive. The altitude can sometimes make people emotional." The condescension was breathtaking. She wasn't just denying it, she was gaslighting her. "It has nothing to do with altitude, and everything to do with blatant disrespect," Serafina countered, her voice rising slightly. "I saw your flight attendants mocking my hair. I've been treated differently from every other passenger in this cabin." Brenda leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial, venomous whisper. "Let me be frank. First class has certain standards of presentation. Your hairstyle is quite large. We have to consider the comfort of all passengers. Some might find it obstructive, and frankly, the unkempt look can be a bit alarming." Unkempt. The word hit Serafina like a slap. Her hair, which she spent hours carefully washing, conditioning, and shaping, was being called unkempt. It was a classic racist trope, and Brenda had wielded it like a weapon. "My hair is clean professional, and it is not obstructing anyone," Serafina said, her voice trembling with a rage she could no longer contain. "Your prejudice is the only thing that is alarming here. I want your name and your employee number. I will be filing a formal complaint with Orion Air the moment we land." Brenda's eyes narrowed into slits. The threat, instead of intimidating her, seemed to amuse her. She straightened up her professional mask, slipping back into place, now layered with an icy superiority. "My name is Brenda Walsh, and I have been with this airline for 22 years. I've served celebrities, politicians, and royalty," she said, her voice loud enough for the nearby passengers to hear. "I know how to do my job. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have actual duties to attend to." She turned on her heel and walked away, leaving Serafina sitting in a pool of stunned silence. The businessman in 1A, Mr. Peterson, shot her a look of annoyance, as if she were the one causing a disturbance. The elderly couple pointedly looked out their window. No one intervened. No one offered a word of support. She was alone in her humiliation cast as the difficult, sensitive woman. Tiffany and Mark now felt even more emboldened. As they cleared the lunch trays, they accidentally skipped Serafina's. Her plate of untouched food sat on her table for the better part of an hour, a monument to her ostracization. When she finally pressed the call button again to have it removed, Tiffany came by sighing dramatically. "Oh, did we forget you?" she asked, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "It's just so hard to see past. Well, you know." She gestured vaguely at Serafina's head. Serafina didn't respond. She simply stared straight ahead, her jaw clenched. She would not cry. She would not give them that satisfaction. She retreated into herself, building a wall of ice around her heart. She counted the minutes. 6 more hours. 5. 4. She focused on the thought of Adrian. His warm embrace, his calm voice. He would know what to do. He always did. She just had to endure until then. But with every passing minute, under the weight of the crew's relentless cruelty, her endurance was fraying to a thread. The cabin lights had been dimmed for several hours, casting the first-class section in a tranquil artificial twilight. Most passengers were asleep or watching movies, their faces illuminated by the blue glow of their screens. Serafina hadn't slept a wink. She stared blankly at the flight map, watching the tiny icon of their plane inch its way across the vast expanse of the Atlantic. Each mile felt like a victory, a small step closer to the end of this ordeal. The crew's torment had subsided into a cold war of neglect. Her water glass remained empty. Offers of snacks or drinks that were made to everyone else simply bypassed seat 2A. She was invisible, a ghost in the luxurious machine. The deliberate isolation was in some ways more painful than the overt mockery. It was a systematic erasure of her presence. With about 90 minutes left until landing, the cabin lights slowly brightened. The crew began preparations for the pre-arrival service. Serafina watched as Brenda directed Tiffany and Mark with crisp efficiency. They were a well-oiled team of tormentors. Brenda caught Serafina's eye and offered a tiny triumphant smirk before turning away. She had won. She had put the upstart in her place. It was then that the sound came. The distinct, secure click of the cockpit door unlocking. Heads turned mostly out of idle curiosity. It wasn't unusual for a pilot to step out to use the lavatory or stretch their legs on a long-haul flight. A tall, broad-shouldered man in a crisp white pilot's shirt and black trousers stepped into the first-class cabin. He had dark, neatly combed hair, a strong jaw, and an air of quiet, unshakable confidence. On the epaulets of his shirt were 4 gold bars, signifying his rank as captain. Brenda's demeanor changed instantly. Her spine straightened, the disdain on her face melting away to be replaced by a dazzling, deferential smile. This was an opportunity. Captains wrote reports. Captains had influence. "Captain, can I get you a coffee?" She chirped, her voice several octaves higher than the one she'd used with Serafina. Tiffany and Mark hovered nearby, eager to be seen as attentive and professional in the presence of the flight deck commander. The captain's eyes scanned the cabin, a brief professional survey. Then they landed on seat 2A, and they stayed there. The professional mask dissolved, replaced by a look of such profound love and concern that it seemed to warm the entire cabin. He didn't answer Brenda. Instead, he started walking his path, direct and purposeful, straight towards Serafina. Serafina looked up, and for the first time in hours, a genuine emotion other than pain crossed her face. Relief, a wave of it so powerful it almost buckled her. She gave him a small, watery smile. The captain reached her seat and leaned down, ignoring the perplexed stares of the crew. He gently cupped her cheek, his thumb stroking away a tear she hadn't even realized had fallen. "Hey, you," he murmured, his voice a low, intimate rumble. "You look tired. Was the flight okay?" Brenda watched her smile faltering. Who was this woman to the captain? A friend? A relative he was meeting on board. Serafina shook her head slightly, unable to speak past the lump forming in her throat. Her eyes told him everything he needed to know. The exhaustion, the hurt, the humiliation. The captain's expression hardened. The warmth vanished, replaced by a glacial calm that was far more terrifying than any outburst of anger. He straightened up and turned his gaze, falling upon Brenda. "You're the purser on this flight?" he asked. His voice was no longer the intimate murmur he'd used with Serafina. It was cold, sharp, and carried an unmistakable weight of authority. "Yes, Captain." Brenda said, her confidence returning. This was her chance to frame the narrative. "Brenda Walsh. We seem to have a rather disgruntled passenger here. She's been making some accusations against my crew." She gestured dismissively toward Serafina. "We've done our best to provide excellent service, but some people are just impossible to please." The captain's eyes were like chips of ice. "A disgruntled passenger," he repeated, his voice dangerously soft. "This disgruntled passenger is Dr. Serafina Hayes, a world-class surgeon who has spent the last 3 months saving children's lives in a war zone while you were serving champagne." Brenda's jaw went slack. The color began to drain from her face. Tiffany and Mark froze by the galley, their eyes wide with dawning horror. The captain took a small step closer to Brenda. He wasn't yelling. He didn't need to. His quiet fury was more potent than any shout. "And she is impossible to please. You think serving a passenger with basic human dignity is an impossible task," he continued. "You think whispered insults and mocking gestures are part of the Orion Air Service standard. Captain, I don't know what you mean." Brenda stammered, her voice a pathetic squeak. The captain ignored her feeble denial. He looked from her to Tiffany, then to Mark, his gaze pinning each of them in turn. "I'm sure you don't." He then reached up and adjusted his collar, a simple, deliberate movement. And that's when they saw it. Pinned to the collar of his pilot shirt, just below his 4 gold bars, was not the standard Orion Air pilot wings. It was a unique, stylized silver crest, a constellation of Orion underlined by a single bold wing. It was a crest only a handful of people in the entire company were authorized to wear. It wasn't the insignia of a line pilot. It was the insignia of the executive board. Brenda stared at the crest, her mind refusing to process what she was seeing. She looked at his name tag for the first time, not just his rank. The engraved letters were clear and damning. A. Vance Adrian Vance, son of the airline's founder, a legendary pilot in his own right, and more importantly, the current executive vice president of flight operations and chief of standards for all of Orion Air. He was the man who literally wrote the rules they were supposed to follow. He was the ultimate authority on everything that happened in the air. And Dr. Serafina Hayes, the woman they had spent the last 7 hours tormenting, the woman whose hair they called unpleasant. The captain looked down at Serafina, his expression softening once more. He took her hand. Then he looked back at the petrified crew. He let the silence hang in the air for a moment, thick and suffocating. Then he delivered the final devastating blow, his voice clear and resonant in the stunned cabin. "You've been making accusations about a passenger," he said. His eyes locked on Brenda's. "But what you fail to understand is that you haven't just been insulting a passenger. You've been insulting my wife." The word wife detonated in the silent cabin like a bomb. Brenda Walsh, who had built her entire identity on 22 years of impeccable service and iron-fisted control over her domain, physically recoiled. A soft gasp escaped her painted lips. The blood drained from her face, leaving her with a pasty waxen complexion. Her eyes, wide with terror, darted from Adrian's cold, furious face to Serafina's quiet, tear-streaked one. The entire flight, every sneer, every whisper, every calculated act of neglect flashed before her eyes, now recontextualized as career suicide. Tiffany looked as if she might faint. Her hand flew to her mouth, and she stumbled back against the galley counter, her knees weak. Mark just stood there, completely frozen, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. He looked like a cornered animal. The other passengers, who had previously been content to ignore the drama, were now sitting bolt upright, their attention fully captured. Mr. Peterson in 1A had his glasses perched on his nose, staring with undisguised shock. The theatre was no longer a minor disturbance. It was a full-blown spectacle of power and consequence. Adrian Vance ignored them all. His focus was a laser beam fixed on the 3 crew members who had wounded his wife. "Brenda Walsh," he said, his voice dropping to a low, lethal register. "You have been with this company for 22 years. You better than anyone should know what the Orion Air Code of Conduct stands for. Dignity, respect, inclusivity. These aren't just words in a manual. They are the bedrock of this airline." He took another step forward. Brenda flinched. "You are the cabin service manager, the leader. You set the tone, and the tone you set today was one of bigotry, harassment, and targeted humiliation." Adrian continued, his voice precise and cutting. "You didn't just fail at your job, you actively defiled the uniform you're wearing." He turned his gaze to Tiffany. "And you, eager to impress your superior by joining in on the cruelty. You think this is how you build a career, by mocking a passenger, by dehumanizing someone because they don't fit your narrow, prejudiced worldview." Tiffany began to tremble, tears welling in her eyes. I'm so sorry. I didn't." "You didn't what?" Adrian shot back, his voice sharp as broken glass. "You didn't know she was my wife, is that it? So your behavior would have been acceptable if she were just another black woman in first class, if she didn't have a powerful husband to stand up for her. Is that the standard of your character?" Tiffany broke down completely, covering her face with her hands and sobbing. Adrian's unforgiving gaze moved to Mark, who seemed to shrink under its weight. And you, laughing along, a willing participant. You have a choice in every moment of your life who you want to be, and you chose to be a bully. He pulled out his satellite phone, the one reserved for the flight deck and executive use. He scrolled through his contacts and pressed a button. He didn't move to the galley for privacy. He stood right there in the middle of the first-class cabin, making it a public execution. "Robert, it's Adrian Vance," he said into the phone. The cabin was so quiet that everyone could hear the faint, tinny voice of the person on the other end. Robert Harrison was the CEO of Orion Air. "I'm on flight OA-101 from Heathrow. Yes, in the cabin. No, everything is not fine." There was a pause. Adrian looked directly at Brenda as he spoke. "I am invoking my executive authority. I need you to scramble the ground support team at JFK. I want a new first-class crew, ready and waiting at the gate. The current purser, Brenda Walsh, and flight attendants, Tiffany Miller and Mark Stanton, are to be relieved of their duties the moment the jet bridge connects. They will be met by corporate security and HR." Brenda let out a choked sob. Being relieved mid-duty was the ultimate humiliation, a neon sign of catastrophic failure. "Yes, a full investigation is to be launched immediately," Adrian continued into the phone. "I am the primary witness. The charge is gross misconduct, including targeted harassment and discriminatory behavior, in violation of company policy and federal law. Have their credentials and access badges suspended pending the outcome of the investigation, which I assure you is a formality." He paused. "Thank you, Robert." He ended the call and slipped the phone back into his pocket. The finality of his actions hung in the air. He had, in the space of 3 minutes, dismantled 3 careers. He turned back to the crew. "You will complete the pre-arrival service for the other passengers with the utmost professionalism. You will not speak to my wife again. You will not even look in her direction. When we land, you will gather your personal belongings and await your escort off this aircraft. Is that understood?" Brenda Tiffany and Mark all nodded numbly, their faces ashen. The arrogance and condescension were gone, replaced by the raw, primal fear of people who have just watched their lives crumble. Adrian returned to Serafina's side. He knelt beside her seat, taking both of her hands in his. The entire cabin watched as this powerful executive, this titan of the airline industry, became just a husband, his face etched with worry and love. "I am so sorry, Sarah," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I am so sorry this happened to you. On my airline, this is my fault." "No," she whispered back, her voice hoarse. "It's not your fault, Adrian. It's theirs." She squeezed his hand, drawing strength from his presence. The ice wall around her heart was finally beginning to melt, washed away by the fierce, protective tide of his love. For the last hour of the flight, an eerie silence descended. Brenda Tiffany and Mark moved through the cabin like automatons, their faces blank masks of shock. Their movements were jerky, their smiles for the other passengers brittle and fake. They were the walking dead, and everyone knew it. The power dynamic had not just shifted. It had been inverted with brutal, breathtaking speed. The reckoning had begun at 30,000 feet, but they all knew the worst was yet to come once they were back on solid ground. The touchdown at JFK International Airport was smooth, but for Brenda Tiffany and Mark, it felt like a descent into hell. As the massive aircraft taxied towards the gate, the reality of their situation began to solidify into a cold, hard dread. Through the small cabin windows, they could see it, a black SUV, parked on the tarmac near their designated gate, an unusual and ominous sight. The moment the fasten seatbelt sign pinged off, Adrian stood up. He helped Serafina with her coat, his movements gentle and deliberate. He completely ignored the disgraced crew. As the jet bridge began to connect with a heavy thud, 2 stern-faced individuals, a man in a sharp suit and a woman with a severe haircut holding a folder, stepped onto the aircraft. They were from Ryanair Corporate Security and Human Resources. The HR woman, Ms. Albright, had eyes that missed nothing. She immediately spotted Adrian and gave a respectful nod. "Mr. Vance, Dr. Hayes, we're here to handle things. A car is waiting to take you home whenever you're ready." Adrian nodded back. "Thank you, Janice." Ms. Albright then turned her attention to the 3 crew members huddled near the galley. "Brenda Walsh, Tiffany Miller, Mark Stanton, please gather your personal effects. You will be escorted from the aircraft. Your airline credentials have been suspended. You are not to access any other part of the airport. A formal meeting is scheduled for each of you tomorrow morning at headquarters." Her voice was devoid of emotion, a clinical pronouncement of their fate. Brenda, who had always walked through this airport like she owned it, now looked like a trespasser. She grabbed her handbag, her hands shaking so badly she could barely work the clasp. Tiffany was still crying, silently, mascara smudged down her cheeks. Mark just stared at the floor, his face pale. As Serafina and Adrian prepared to deplane a passenger from a few rows back, a quiet woman who had been reading for most of the flight stood up. She approached Serafina hesitantly. "Dr. Hayes," she said softly. "I'm so sorry. I heard what they were saying. It was disgusting. I should have said something." She looked ashamed. I have a video on my phone. When the blonde one was mocking your hair, I recorded it, if you need it for anything. Serafina was taken aback. In her isolation, she had assumed no one cared. Thank you, she said, genuinely touched. Thank you so much. Adrian gave the woman a grateful look and handed her his business card. Please email that to my assistant. We would appreciate that very much. The formal hearings were less of an investigation and more of a sentencing. Brenda went in first, attempting to salvage her career with a performance of contrition. She claimed it was all a terrible misunderstanding. I was merely concerned about cabin aesthetics, she argued, her voice trembling. My comments were taken out of context. 22 years of flawless service must count for something. Ms. Albright was unmoved. She slid a folder across the polished boardroom table. This is your file, Ms. Walsh. It is not flawless. Over the past 5 years, there have been 7 informal passenger complaints logged against you, all noting a condescending attitude or dismissive behavior, primarily from passengers of color. We dismissed them as subjective at the time, a mistake we will not be making again. Then Miss Albright played the video sent by the other passenger. The footage was crystal clear. It showed Tiffany patting her own hair and then making the large mocking gesture around her head, followed by her and Mark's cruel laughter. It showed Brenda watching them with a smirk of approval. Brenda's defense crumbled into dust. The verdict was swift and brutal. Brenda Walsh was terminated for gross misconduct and violation of the company's anti-harassment policy. Because of the nature of her termination, her severance package was voided, and she would lose a significant portion of her unvested pension. The 22 years she had lorded over Serafina now amounted to nothing but a legacy of shame. She was escorted from the building, a pariah in the industry she had dedicated her life to. Tiffany Miller's hearing was next. She was sobbing before she even sat down, begging for a second chance. I'm not a racist, I was just trying to fit in, Brenda. She can be very intimidating. I was scared of her. Fear does not excuse bigotry, Ms. Miller, Ms. Albright stated coldly. You are an adult and responsible for your own actions. She pointed to a printout of Tiffany's social media profile, which her influencer dreams were built upon. It was filled with hashtags like flight attendant life and jet set. Your ambition seems to have outweighed your integrity. Your employment with Orion Air is terminated effective immediately. Tiffany left the room, her dreams of becoming a travel influencer shattered. The video, once it was leaked to the press by an internal source, would make her infamous for all the wrong reasons. Mark Stanton offered no defense. He simply sat there, defeated. I have no excuse, he said quietly. What I did was wrong. I am ashamed of myself. His quiet admission did nothing to change the outcome. He was also fired. He had chosen to follow the bullies, and now he would fall with them. But the consequences didn't end with them. The story, fueled by the passenger's video and an official statement from Orion Air, went viral. It was picked up by major news outlets. The headlines were brutal. Orion Air crew mocks surgeon's natural hair in first class. Airline ex-wife targeted in racist incident. Orion Air was facing a public relations nightmare. Their stock dipped. Boycotts were threatened. The incident had exposed a rot that went deeper than just 3 employees. It was systemic. Robert Harrison, the CEO, knew that firing the crew wasn't enough. The airline had to do more. He called Adrian and Serafina to a private meeting a week later. Dr. Hayes, he began, his expression grim. On behalf of this entire company, I want to offer our most profound and sincere apology. What happened to you is inexcusable and represents a catastrophic failure on our part. Serafina listened, her expression unreadable. She had spent the week decompressing, processing the violation. It wasn't about revenge for her. It was about ensuring this never happened to anyone else. "An apology is a start," Adrian said, his arm resting protectively around his wife's shoulders. "But what are you going to do to fix the culture that allowed this to happen?" That was the question, and Orion Air had an answer. The reckoning was not just for the crew, it was for the entire airline. The fallout from Flight OA101 was not a storm. It was a Category 5 hurricane that made landfall directly on Orion Air's gleaming corporate headquarters. The passenger's video, leaked by an outraged mid-level employee in the IT department, had gone supernova online. It played on every major news network, was dissected on morning talk shows, and became the subject of 1,000 op-eds about race, class, and corporate culture in modern America. The hashtag #FlyWithDignity trended for a week, inextricably linked with Orion Air's name. The company's stock took a nosedive, and calls for a boycott grew louder each day. Firing the 3 crew members had been a necessary first step, but the public, and more importantly, Adrian and Serafina, knew it was merely treating a symptom, not the disease. CEO Robert Harrison, a man accustomed to managing turbulence in the market, now faced a crisis of conscience and brand identity. Under immense pressure, and with Adrian Vance's formidable presence in every meeting, he knew a simple apology tour would not suffice. The company needed to perform radical surgery on itself. 2 weeks after the incident, Harrison convened a mandatory company-wide virtual town hall. Over 50,000 employees, from pilots in Singapore to gate agents in Chicago, watched as their CEO stood on a stage, the Orion Air logo behind him, looking less like a symbol of prestige and more like a mark of shame. The atmosphere was thick with tension and uncertainty. For the last 40 years, we have prided ourselves on being the airline that connects the world. Harrison began, his voice somber. But recently, we were shown in the most public and painful way that we have failed to connect with the basic principles of human decency within our own cabins. We did not just fail a passenger, we failed a black woman. We failed a humanitarian. We failed the wife of one of our own leaders. And in doing so, we failed ourselves. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. Terminations are not a solution. They are a consequence. The solution must be a fundamental change in our culture. It must be about education, empathy, and accountability. That is why, effective immediately, Orion Air is launching the most comprehensive mandatory diversity and inclusivity training program in the history of this industry. He gestured to a screen behind him where a new logo appeared. It was the Orion constellation, intertwined with a graceful script. "We will call it the Hayes Initiative," Harrison announced, his voice ringing with conviction. "So that the name of the woman we wronged will forever be a reminder of our commitment to do right. So that her experience becomes the bedrock upon which we build a better, more respectful, and truly inclusive airline." Serafina watched the broadcast from her living room, Adrian's hand resting on her shoulder. When Harrison had first proposed the name, she had recoiled. The thought of her name being eternally linked to that humiliation felt like a fresh wound. But Adrian helped her reframe it. "They tried to erase you, Sarah," he'd said. "Now your name will be written into the very DNA of this company as a force for good. It's not their story anymore, it's yours." Her involvement became direct and deeply personal. She met with the top-tier diversity consultants hired by the airline. In a sterile boardroom, surrounded by charts and buzzwords, Serafina brought a grounding human element. She spoke about the difference between a welcoming smile and a tolerant smile. She insisted on a module dedicated entirely to understanding the cultural significance of black hair, explaining how terms like unkempt or unprofessional have been used for centuries as tools of oppression. She helped craft role-playing scenarios that were brutally realistic, forcing employees to confront uncomfortable situations from both the employee and passenger perspectives. Her quiet authority and lived experience were more powerful than any textbook. Meanwhile, Adrian waged his own war within the corporate structure. He championed the internal audit that uncovered the unsettling pattern of complaints against Brenda Walsh, a pattern that had been systemically ignored. He faced down older board members who grumbled about the exorbitant cost of the initiative, retorting in a heated meeting, "The cost of losing our soul is infinitely higher, gentlemen, and we are perilously close to that." He tied executive bonuses to new diversity and inclusion metrics, ensuring that the commitment to change was financially incentivized from the top down. The hard karma, as some online commentators called it, continued to ripple through the lives of the disgraced crew. Brenda's fall was the most spectacular. She attempted an interview with a budget competitor airline. The hiring manager, a young, sharp woman, looked at her resume, then up at her face. "Brenda Walsh," she said, tapping her pen. "From Orion Air. I saw that video. The interview is over." The public shaming was complete. She was forced to sell her meticulously kept condo, the symbol of her status, and retreat into an anonymous life haunted by the 22 years of her career that now felt like a long, arrogant dream that had ended in a nightmare. Tiffany's influencer world imploded. A wellness brand she had promoted posted a statement officially severing ties with her, citing a commitment to positive and inclusive values. The comment sections on her old posts became a digital monument to her disgrace. She eventually scrubbed her entire online presence and was last seen working at a cosmetics counter in a suburban mall, the forced smile she gave customers a pale imitation of the one she once flashed in the aisles of first class. For Serafina and Adrian, the months that followed were a period of healing and purpose. They established the Hayes Foundation, funding it with a significant personal contribution matched by a donation from Orion Air. Their mission was to champion diversity, not just in aviation, but across all corporate sectors. Almost a year to the day after the incident, Serafina found herself on another Orion Air flight, heading to a global health summit in Vienna. As she settled into her seat, she felt a familiar, faint flicker of anxiety. It was a scar, a muscle memory of humiliation. A flight attendant approached a young man with a kind face. He saw her boarding pass, and his eyes widened slightly in recognition. "Dr. Hayes," he said, his voice imbued with a genuine warmth and respect that was unmistakable. "It is an absolute honor to have you on board with us today. Please let me know if there is anything at all I can do to make your flight more comfortable." Later, as she walked past the galley, she saw it pinned to the bulletin board was a memo, and next to it, the cover of the Hayes Initiative training manual. A new generation of crew was learning a new way. She returned to her seat and looked out the window at the clouds below. The sky was the same, endless, beautiful blue. But something had fundamentally changed. The ugliness she had endured had not been in vain. It had been alchemized by courage, by accountability, and by love into a force for change. The turbulence had been severe, threatening to tear everything apart. But in its wake, it had cleared the air, leaving behind a new horizon, one that promised a smoother, more dignified journey for everyone. The impact of the Orion Air incident, and more specifically the swift and decisive actions taken by Adrian Vance and the subsequent Hayes Initiative, resonated far beyond the confines of the airline industry. Serafina found herself unexpectedly thrust into the role of an advocate, her story becoming a focal point for discussions about racial bias, microaggressions, and the importance of corporate responsibility. Invitations poured in from news outlets, universities, and human rights organizations. Initially, hesitant Serafina, with Adrian's gentle encouragement, began to share her experience. She spoke not of personal vindication, but of the systemic issues her ordeal had brought to light. Her calm, articulate voice, devoid of bitterness, resonated deeply with audiences around the world. She emphasized the insidious nature of microaggressions, the small, often unintentional, but nonetheless harmful acts of prejudice that chip away at a person's sense of belonging and dignity. It wasn't just about the bad salmon or the forgotten water, she would explain in interviews. It was the constant, subtle messaging that I didn't belong, that my natural self was somehow an affront in that space. And that is a feeling that far too many people experience every single day in all sorts of environments. Adrian, in his capacity at Orion Air, became a vocal champion for diversity and inclusion within the aviation sector. He didn't shy away from the uncomfortable truths that Serafina's experience had exposed. He spoke at industry conferences, sharing Orion Air's journey and urging other airlines to adopt similar comprehensive training programs. He commissioned an internal audit of Orion Air's customer service protocols and hiring practices, identifying areas where unconscious biases might be inadvertently perpetuated. The findings, though at times unflattering, were met with a commitment to real change, not just superficial adjustments. The Hayes Initiative became a benchmark for corporate social responsibility. Other companies in various sectors reached out to Orion Air, eager to learn about the program's development and implementation. Serafina found herself consulting informally with some of these organizations, sharing her insights and emphasizing the importance of authenticity and genuine commitment from leadership. Life for Brenda, Tiffany, and Mark took drastically different turns, none of them leading to a redemption arc within the skies. Brenda's attempts to find employment in the service industry were met with closed doors and uncomfortable silences. Her name was now synonymous with the Orion Air scandal, a cautionary tale whispered in HR departments. She eventually moved to a small town in a different state, taking a low-paying job far removed from the world of first-class luxury she had once inhabited. The loss of her status and the stark realization of how her prejudice had defined her career served as a bitter, isolating punishment. Tiffany's foray into social media infamy backfired spectacularly. While the initial wave of attention brought a surge of followers, it was overwhelmingly negative. The video of her mocking Serafina became a viral example of racist behavior. Brands she had hoped to collaborate with steered clear. Her online presence became a magnet for criticism and hate, eventually forcing her to delete her public profiles and retreat from the digital world. The fleeting taste of online fame had curdled into lasting shame. Mark perhaps surprisingly embarked on a path of genuine introspection. His enrollment in sociology courses sparked a profound shift in his understanding of social dynamics and systemic inequalities. He began volunteering with local community organizations focused on diversity and inclusion, quietly working to educate himself and others. It was a slow, arduous process, but one that suggested a genuine desire for personal growth and atonement, albeit far from the public eye. Serafina and Adrian continued their life together, their bond strengthened by the shared experience. They established a foundation in Serafina's name, dedicated to promoting diversity and combating discrimination in various industries. The foundation supported educational initiatives, funded scholarships for underrepresented students, and provided resources for companies committed to building more inclusive workplaces. One day, a letter arrived at their home. It was handwritten on simple, unadorned stationery. It was from Mark. He didn't ask for forgiveness, but he wrote about his journey of learning and understanding. He acknowledged the harm he had caused and expressed his commitment to being a better person. Serafina read the letter with a thoughtful expression, a sense of closure settling within her. It wasn't forgiveness she felt, but a quiet acknowledgement that even in the darkest moments, the potential for change, however slow and personal, could exist. Years passed. The Orion Air incident faded from the daily news cycle, but its impact remained. Airlines around the world had adopted stricter anti-discrimination policies and implemented more robust diversity training programs, many modeled after the Hayes Initiative. The conversation around natural hair in professional settings had also shifted, with more companies recognizing and respecting diverse hairstyles. Serafina continued her work as a surgeon, her dedication undiminished. She remained a fierce advocate for her patients and for equity in healthcare. Adrian continued to rise within Orion Air, his leadership guided by a deeper understanding of the human impact of his decisions. Occasionally, when they traveled, they would encounter flight crews who would approach Serafina with a quiet word of thanks or recognition of the changes that had occurred within the industry. These small moments served as a poignant reminder of the ripple effect of one woman's dignified response to injustice and one man's unwavering commitment to doing what was right. The skies hadn't become entirely prejudice-free, but they were undeniably different. The seeds of change had been sown in the pressurized cabin of a transatlantic flight, nurtured by courage and a demand for accountability. And as Serafina looked out of the window of another airplane, her natural hair a proud halo around her face, she knew that the fight for equality was ongoing, but the horizon looked a little brighter. The hard karma that had struck down those who mocked her had ultimately paved the way for a more inclusive and respectful world, one flight at a time. The story of Dr. Serafina Hayes is a powerful reminder that dignity is not a privilege of class. It is a fundamental human right. It's a story about how the quiet poison of prejudice can fester even in the most luxurious of settings, and how the courage of one person, backed by the conviction of another, can trigger a revolution of accountability. They tried to diminish her to make her feel unworthy of the seat she occupied. In the end, her strength and her husband's unwavering support didn't just win a battle on a single flight, it reshaped an entire corporate culture. If this story of justice and empowerment resonated with you, please help it reach others by hitting the like button. Share it with someone who needs to hear that standing up for what is right matters. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more true life stories that inspire challenge and remind us of the power we all hold. Thank you for listening.